Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we are changing the mental health narrative, bringing hope and solutions. Here's your host, Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist.
George Lindenfeld, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and founder of the Medical Psychology Center in Asheville, North Carolina, which specializes in the evaluation and treatment of traumatic life experiences. He is the creator of Reset Therapy, which stands for Reconsolidation Enhancement by Stimulation of Emotional Triggers for the resolution of post-traumatic stress disorder. This process includes the use of the bioacoustical utilization device, BAUD for short. Welcome.
Thank you.
So what got you started in the work you're doing and what drives your passion for it?
So, Tim, I didn't realize it, but as a youngster, my grandfather, who was born in Austria-Hungary, migrated over to the U.S. to avoid being drafted into the Hungarian army. And I would ask him about his family. He came from a large family of about 8 or 9. And when I did that, his face would get ashen, and he looked like he checked out. And I didn't realize it, but I certainly do now, is that he had PTSD. So my inspiration goes way, way back in time. He lost his entire family in the Holocaust, and he just couldn't cope with it. So unbeknownst to me, there was a driving force to, what is this? How does it do this to someone? And more important, is there a way to alter it, to set a person back on their life course? Now, I started out in the Navy Seabees, swinging a pick in a coral, and I thought, you know what? I think I can do a little better than that. So I was in the Navy Reserves, ended up in St. Albans Naval Hospital for mono and jaundice and hepatitis. And this is not the kind of life I want to live. So I applied to go to college, and I was too sick to take the college entrance exam. This was at Oswego State University in New York. I applied to be a shop teacher. And wonderful people, they said, you know what? You're a vet. We're going to give you a chance. So they let me in with no test. Said, you got to have a B average if you're going to continue. So by my bootstraps, I pulled myself up to Windy Hills in Oswego, New York. This was in the winter, to learn to become a shop teacher. And I was intent on doing that. I minored in psychology. Again, this was part of the fascination of what makes people tick. And indeed, I became a shop teacher. And the powers that be threw all these troubled kids into my class out of algebra and this science class and that class, and they put them with me. So I figured, here's a chance to learn about these kids and for me to expand my knowledge. So I signed up for a master's degree in school psychology in the city of New York. I would drive in at night, and that took me about 5 years to accomplish while I was teaching. And right about the time I got my master's, New York State decided you have to have a doctorate to be in charge. Otherwise, you got to work under a doctorate. Now, I'm a stubborn cuss. I admit it. And I said, you know what? I've gone this far. I don't want to work under someone else. I'm going to go ahead and get the doctorate. So I packed up my family, dragged them out to Utah, Logan, Utah, up in the mountains, and started a Psy.D. I began with, and it turned into a PhD in child and developmental psychology. So my path was kind of unfolding, even though I wasn't fully aware of it, taking me to, I believe, where I was meant to go. I spent a year postdoc at the University of Oregon Medical School, and that qualified me to be a clinical psychologist, so I could and did treat whoever came through my door. And I tried the traditional therapies, to make a long story short, to see what I could do about this PTSD stuff. Again, being a veteran, I was committed to changing the stats of 20 to 22 vets taking their own life every day due to PTSD. And you know what? I found the traditional stuff just didn't work. I'm sure there are some out there that find it wonderful. I just didn't. I couldn't find a way to get talk to alter the effects of trauma. And it perplexed me through a great part of my practice. Now, I've had over 50 years in practice. About 10 years ago, my daughter, who's also a psychologist, Dr. Catherine Billiot, came upon this sound device at a workshop she went to. It's called the BAUD. And she came home and said, "Dad, I think you might be interested in this for what you're doing." And honestly, that's been my interest from that point on. The use of binaural sound has been fascinating for me. And I believe that it is a key, when it's done properly, to unlock the memory system. We call it reconsolidation of memory. That gives us an opportunity to alter trauma memory. And by the time we're done, free the individual of the emotional aspects of that experience. I'll take a breath to inquire if you have any questions, because I can go on and on.
So how long ago was it that you started about the BAUD?
I'm going to say about 8 years ago.
Okay. And the BAUD stands for Bioacoustical Utilization Device?
That is correct. It is a little battery-driven device with 4 knobs that sets off a sound, a frequency that I call it is used to tune in to resonate with trauma circuitry in the brain. And it's then offset by up to 20 hertz, which creates a special effect called a binaural beat. Nobody else can hear it, only the listener. And that key, I believe, unlocks that trauma memory and opens it up to alteration.
So when that happens and the person is using the BAUD device, do you then guide them to how to reinterpret or reconstruct the memory, or are they doing that all on their own?
Well, I perceive of this as a non-verbal intervention. So I will explain the process to my patient. I tell them you have to activate it. You have to activate the experience. So if you just think about it, you're not going to get anywhere. This is a sensory-based intervention. So my promise is, if you'll open it up one more time and experience that experience, that'll be the path for you to be free of it. So I'm discouraging thinking, and I kind of stay out of it during the process, except I'm helping guide them to get the proper settings. Now, the volume part is pretty simplistic. Here they set the volume in each ear. So it reaches a point that it's fairly loud, but it's not troublesome. I also use another type of headphone that I call bone conducting for some people that are ultra sensitive to sound or have some hearing loss in one or both ears as an alternative to traditional headphones. Generally, people like that a great deal, and I think they prefer that over the traditional headphones.
So, in the understanding that I have of memory reconsolidation is that when a memory is accessed experientially, or as they talk about in coherence therapy, when we tap into the implicit emotional memory,
yes,
it opens up a window of 4 to 5 hours during which time that memory can be reconsolidated, reconstructed, reinterpreted. All these different words are there. And in the coherence therapy, they're doing this experiential process and then juxtaposing an implicit truth from the past that's related to trauma and implicit truth from the present, which is usually grounded in safety, or the whole, the mature person who survived the trauma. In this work, you're not doing any juxtapositioning. You're simply asking the individual to re-experience the trauma with the addition of the binaural sound. Is that correct?
That is correct. I simply don't find it as complicated. By the way, RESET stands for Reconsolidation Enhancement by Stimulation of Emotional Triggers.
Okay.
So by getting that sound, that binaural beat, to resonate properly with the trauma circuitry, the change occurs. I haven't had to juxtapose anything.
And so are you working the two other knobs other than the volume controls on the BAUD, or are you letting the individual manipulate those frequencies themselves?
It depends. Some people just take to it naturally and do very well with it. Others are distracted and they get into the thinking process. And if that's the case, I will assist them by doing the adjustments. I want them to stay focused on the sensory experience. I'm also monitoring bodily signs. So I'm looking at chest breathing. I'm looking at abdominal breathing. I'm looking at muscular and facial grimacing. I'm taking in a lot of information at that time.
And how long is the average session when you're using the BAUD?
Well, I don't know if you've had this experience. I've seen changes in 5 minutes or under. Typically, when the setting appears to be correct, and I will use SUDs for the patient to determine if there's some change in effect. Now, generally, there are 3 populations that I encounter. One, there's an immediate change of anywhere from 3 to 5 points on a 10-point SUD scale. The other may be a couple of points. And the third, no change. In the no change group, I come to the position that the settings are simply not correct. And I have to work a little harder to find them. In the other 2 groups, after the 5-minute trial, I'll give them the session off. We'll talk about things. What happened to you? What did you notice? I'm looking for a fading of the stimulus. So many describe it like a cloud that's lifting. In the 5-minute dramatic changes, I notice that the eyes light up. It's like a person has come back into the body. In fact, let me talk to you about my concept of resilience. So I'm going afield. This is an article I'm working on now. I'm looking at homeless female veterans that experience military sexual trauma. And I believe it's the internetwork connectivity that elicits resilience in the individual. So when we get rid of the trauma circuitry and reinstate pre-trauma circuitry, resilience returns dramatically. That's my concept. I'm going to test it out. There's another part of this study that I want to talk to you about.
So are there other devices, tools, techniques that are involved in your reset program?
Not at this point. I think it'd be nice to have an app, and that's in consideration down the road, so that we could have it on the iPhone or other phone systems to make it available at a reasonable cost. And certainly that's
having, you mean having the BAUD binaural
Yes,
sounds available?
Yeah. Having the binaural sounds available through a common use, easy, accessible, reasonably priced instrument. I think that would facilitate a person's treatment. They can learn to self-administer once they learn the frequencies. So there's all kinds of potential applications.
It's quite intriguing. I know that there are a few people that I have loaned the BAUD to for a weekend to go home and do self-administration, and varying results. Usually, as you're talking about, there's many of the people that I do it with get all caught up in their head and thinking through it.
Yeah.
And a few of them really grasp the idea of just getting into the felt sense of the upsetting situation or memory and letting the BAUD do its work. So I think it would be a great idea if it was as portable as people's smartphones.
Yeah. The coaching to avoid the thinking and stay with the senses. Now, I use the term Mikey likes it. You're probably familiar with that cereal ad where the brothers are looking at Mikey.
Yeah, Mikey
And I
hates
refer
everything.
to Mikey as the subconscious mind.
Okay.
I think Mikey does the guiding and the healing here to set things right again. I use the expression, you have to feel it to heal it. That might be a good one to share with some of your folks that you're treating.
Yeah, it's basically at the root of coherence therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And at several of the somatic therapies that say you've really got to be doing an experience, a felt sense experience, in order to undo what got downloaded during this traumatic felt sense moment of the trauma.
Absolutely. And that's right on. Since I'm in the space of talking about how I keep myself occupied and busy, I'll chat with you about another article I'm working on. And this is the results of an adult RAD patient, reactive attachment disorder. His parents divorced when he was 3. They played him off against each other, bought him things, bribe him this way, that way. His sense of worth was only based on what he might do for someone else. My concept was to see if I couldn't introject through a surrogate mother a totally loving, accepting experience. Unfortunately, we only did it once. He had about 30 some odd sessions, but we just slipped that in the last time. It had profound effects. He was able to stop the relationship that dominated his life about having to do for you in order to get your approval. I believe he could have used a couple more, but this is in another direction that is intriguing to me. Now, imagine, if you will, those kids separated on our southern border, the effect that had in the bonding between them and their mothers or parents. We accept that that's non-changeable. That may not be true.
So what was the process you used to try and instill a loving mother interject?
Well, first I used, let me call it the traditional use of binaural sound to remove the toxic components of his upraising. That's where those 20 to 30 sessions came in. We also used some talk therapy, Bowen's concept of individuation and how he was meant to be who he was meant to be, not based on meeting his parents' expectations. But on the day we did the surrogate, he had the sound on, headphones on. He was into his space with it. Surrogate came into the room, opened her arms to him, held him, and he was able to conform. He started out with indicators of tears and anger, and that transformed into acceptance and deeper embracing, as reported by the surrogate. He let himself melt into this maternal person. Afterwards, told me he thought he could love. He didn't think that was possible before.
Well, that certainly coincides with a lot of theory and research on reactive attachment disorder and the concept that physical affection or actual emotional connection for someone who's gone through reactive attachment disorder feels painful, physically discordant or painful.
Absolutely. As you well know, many of these people end up with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. They're not exactly loved by our fellow therapists. They're extremely difficult to deal with. And maybe we can understand better why.
So, aside from the reactive attachment disorder and the post-traumatic stress disorder, are there other areas of symptomatology or patterns that you apply the BAUD to?
I don't see why there's any limit. I've always been intrigued with anorexia nervosa, distorted body image, although I've not tried it, but I think there would be applicability there as well. Anxiety disorders, depressions. Why not? Why isn't someone experimenting with these?
So what is the, if you know, what's the availability or the access to BAUD? I mean, how many therapists would you say that you're aware of that are using the BAUD?
Well, in my awareness, a number have it, but they don't know how to use it. So it ends up in a drawer somewhere, which is a shame. Those that use it think very highly of it. I recently trained a female psychiatrist in Australia. She commented on a young girl that was sexually molested, provided one session with the BAUD, and the youngster said, "I'm good. It's gone."
So you train people in the use of the BAUD?
Yes, sir. I train them and certify them.
And so what is that process like? How many sessions and over what length of time?
Well, typically I'll begin with about 5 training sessions. For the certification process, and the time is contingent on the individual's understanding. So I want them to get beyond being stuck with the thinking stuff and into the sensory stuff. That's critical that they make that jump. For the certification, I actually want a session taped that I will review and score up so that they meet criteria for that.
So is all of this training done person to person, or have you taken to doing some of it over the internet?
Oh, yeah, internet. Absolutely. That's the thing.
So you didn't have to fly to Australia?
No, sir. But I did participate in a conference she put on. She said she had 750 people sign up. So she's doing quite well.
So once you certify people, are they then able to train others?
I would assume that's going to be another level. The certification is their competency in providing reset therapy. I'd love to have a bunch of people doing research with me.
So how long have you had the reset therapy name and model?
I'm going to say about 3 to 4 years. I've got a web page, and for a while I was pumping out all kinds of info on it. I've slowed down because I'm not doing the research papers, but the blog sections contains all kinds of information. Would you like the address?
Please.
www.drlindenfeld reset reset therapy therapy.com.
All right. We'll certain to promote that.
Ton of information.
And we'll be certain to promote that in the blog that accompanies this. So what's another aspect of your work or your history in 50 years of doing therapy that we haven't even touched on yet, including, if you want to field the question, what's the one thing that you would like to see changed in the mental health field?
Well, if we have effective treatments that can remediate conditions rapidly, and we're holding on to old concepts simply because, I'd love to see that altered. And I perceive, I've come to the conviction the way to do that is through patient demand. I'm not so sure it's going to come through convincing therapists to make those changes. And in fact, we're seeing some of that now. We see an onset of life coaching. Now, what is life coaching? Isn't that another term for people that want to help guide others that aren't formal therapists? I mean, where's all this stuff coming from? There's a demand out there, which I don't believe is truly being met. You know, people want some balance in their life, and seemingly many of them are not finding it. Those that do, they rave about it. So I see the drive coming through that means. Now, mind you, I was a neurotherapist. So I had thousands of dollars in EEG equipment to be able to work with brain waves. And I was into QEEG for a while, doing brain mapping. And I got bored. Sorry to say. But maybe it would take 20 sessions to get some effective change. And then I compare it with the results of binaural sound, and there just wasn't any comparison. Now, I'm not meaning to upset my colleagues, but I think it's inherent that they explore other ways that can provide people with meaningful relief.
So speaking of other ways, you've mentioned sound, and when doing some research on you, I found also that you are doing some work with light as a therapeutic modality.
Yeah, I use photobiomodulation, infrared light. And I've used it for people with TBI. Again, my commitment was to my fellow veterans. So those coming back from Iraq, Iran, had what's referred to as signature wounds. They had both PTSD and TBI from blast effects or something else. I recommend starting off with clearing the toxic material from the PTSD. And by the way, I think those effects of PTSD linger on even after the so-called treatments lift some of the symptoms. So dementia among those with PTSD is at a higher level than veterans with non-PTSD. I think you've got to get it out of the brain circuitry. At any rate, back to light. I lent an intranasal infrared light to one of the participants in my pilot study, a combat veteran. He used it for 3 months, and he transitioned from being cared for by his wife into being able to fully function on his own. And this was after we cleared up a pretty severe case of PTSD.
And you cleared up the PTSD with the BAUD work?
Yes, sir. He had road rage. He had 5 young kids. He would hide guns in his house with those little kids running around. It was scary.
And so then when you loaned him the photo biomodulation device, would he use that numerous times during the day, twice a day?
2 times. It runs for about 20 minutes, and he did it faithfully. In fact, after the 3 months, he ended up buying his own unit. He became in charge of the county veterans group. He no longer needed to be caretaken by his wife. He was able to secure a teaching type position through telecommunication. He became functional. Now, this is offering promise with Alzheimer's as well. Those of you that want to explore, simply look up infrared light and Alzheimer's on YouTube. You'll see some amazing changes. I don't claim to be an expert in that as I do with the binaural sound, but I certainly have found it to be effective in selective cases. So sound and light are my vehicles.
And are you using just the intranasal, or are you using the headset as well?
I use the headset for myself. At 81, I want to keep my brain intact. So I think that'll ward off any early dementia and let me continue my work as I choose to do. And when I do it right and properly, I'll use it every other day for about a 20-minute sitting. With my kidney stone, I haven't been faithful lately.
Yeah, the body does have its ways of getting our attention.
Yeah.
Well, what else would you want to put in here as a cap, a recap, or a highlight to this podcast?
Well, I think the concept of openness is critical to be able to test out new ways of doing things. The notion of resilience that I threw out to you, in effect, I'm defining it as an intact neuronal network, is something that certainly deserves to be explored. I've observed resilience coming back instantly too many times for it to be a minor aspect. That's a big word, resilience. You can define it pretty much any way you want to.
And you want to define it as an intact neural network?
Yes, sir. Because I think that makes sense.
Intact, and I'm thinking, in my mind, things like well-functioning, flowing, connected, rather than disrupted or impaired.
We have to think about a couple of populations here. So if you want to look at the effects of the ACE inventory,
Right.
adverse childhood experiences, those people that never really had a normative upbringing are going to be different from those, let's say, combat vets that came from a normal background and can inherently switch back to it. So we're going to need two kinds of building platforms to establish that resilience to be effective. That's my thinking at this point. Again, I'm basing this on what I've observed in a number of clinical trials within a pilot study. That's insufficient, needs to be formally assessed and determined. But once again, it makes inherent sense to me that we have a definition that we can actually test. So if I had some money, I'd be looking at fMRIs and things of that sort, where we could check that neuronal network for its intactness. Everything I've done has been self-funded, so I don't have those monies for the fMRI. I've relied on a colleague to provide QEEGs. The problem with Qs, by and large, is that you can't lump them together. So each one stands in its own right. Maybe someday there'll be a way to get a conglomerate of those Qs to show a before and after treatment effect. Those are the things I kick around in my thought processes.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it. Thank you for the input on the BAUD and different ways to use that. It's wonderful to know that you're training people. And if somebody wants to access your wisdom or get training on the BAUD, whether they've got one sitting in a drawer or they want to order their own and learn how to use it effectively in therapy, they can find you at Dr. Lindenfeld resettherapy.com.
Yeah, or I'll give you my email address. It's glindy, GLINDY, 123 @gmail.com.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate your being willing to overcome the physical stresses and join us for this. And I look forward to hearing more about your work as it develops.
Thank you.
George Lindenfeld, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and founder of the Medical Psychology Center in Asheville, North Carolina, which specializes in the evaluation and treatment of traumatic life experiences. He is the creator of Reset Therapy, which stands for Reconsolidation Enhancement by Stimulation of Emotional Triggers for the resolution of post-traumatic stress disorder. This process includes the use of the Bioacoustical Utilization Device, BAUD for short. He served in the Navy Seabees prior to attaining his doctorate in child and developmental psychology at Utah State University in 1971. He completed his residency in medical psychology at the University of Oregon Medical School in 1971 and holds a diplomate in clinical psychology awarded by the ABPP in 1980. He has been certified in EEG biofeedback by the BCIA and the Academy of Certified Neurotherapists. George has served as director of the Inpatient Psychiatric Unit at Geisinger Medical Center in Danville, Pennsylvania, executive director of the CMHC Center for Human Development in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and Seminole County Mental Health Center in Altamont Springs, Florida. As part of his practice working with veterans, he has monitored ongoing memory research and pursued the application of non-invasive potential and neuroacoustical intervention. This has led to the development of Reset Therapy, which has demonstrated rapid and enduring remission of the emotional aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.